The cypress trees whispered warnings through the Louisiana night as boots crushed shells and bone dust along the path to the quarters. Celeste Thibodaux jolted awake on her moss-stuffed pallet, her heart already racing before her mind could grasp why. The air tasted of sulfur and decay, thicker than the usual bayou humidity that clung to Magnolia Bend plantation like a burial shroud. "Get up, girl!" Mordecai Blackwood's voice cut through the darkness like a rusted blade. The overseer's lantern cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of its flame, reaching toward her with grasping fingers. "Master Grimwald wants to see you. Now." The other women in the cramped cabin pressed themselves deeper into their corners, as if making themselves smaller might protect them from whatever evil walked among them tonight. Old Evangeline Boudreaux caught Celeste's eye from across the room, her weathered face carved with knowledge too terrible to speak aloud. The elderly woman's lips moved in silent prayer or perhaps incantation. "I said now." Blackwood's hand shot out, fingers wrapping around Celeste's wrist like iron shackles. His touch burned cold, and for an instant she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not malice, but fear. Even the overseer sensed that tonight was different. The plantation house loomed before them like a monument to suffering, its white columns stained with decades of moss and something darker that never quite washed clean in the rains. Gas lamps flickered in windows that watched like eyes, and the wraparound porch creaked under the weight of unseen presences. As they climbed the steps, the wood groaned beneath their feet, not the ordinary settling of old timber, but something deeper, as if the house itself was awakening. Inside, the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, its bronze pendulum catching lamplight like a hypnotist's watch. The sound echoed longer than it should have, each note hanging in the air until it merged with whispers that seemed to seep from the wallpaper itself. Portraits of dead Grimwalds lined the hallway, their painted eyes following Celeste's passage with expressions that shifted between hunger and accusation. Blackwood stopped before the heavy oak door of Master Bartholomew Grimwald's private study. "Remember your place, girl," he muttered, but his usual cruelty was tempered by something that might have been pity. He knocked 3 times, a rhythm that felt ritualistic, and pushed her inside without waiting for a response. The study was a cathedral of cruelty, lined with books that documented 3 generations of Grimwald dominion over flesh and soul. Hunting trophies mounted on the walls included more than deer and wild boar. Shapes that might once have been human hung in the shadows between legitimate kills. The massive fireplace blazed despite the oppressive heat, casting light that seemed to absorb darkness rather than dispel it. Master Bartholomew Grimwald stood with his back to the door, a figure cut from nightmares and expensive cloth. At 35, he possessed the kind of handsomeness that made his cruelty all the more obscene. Angular features that belonged to a gentleman, corrupted by appetites that would have made demons weep. When he turned, his smile was the practiced expression of a man who had never been denied anything he desired. Celeste. Her name rolled off his tongue like a prayer to dark gods. "Do you know why I've summoned you at this unholy hour?" She kept her eyes downcast as she'd been taught, but her peripheral vision caught movement in the gilt-framed mirror behind his desk. Shapes that weren't reflections drifted through the silvered glass like smoke given form. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, and her breath misted despite the blazing fire. "Look at me when I speak to you." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to absolute power, but underneath lurked something else, anticipation that bordered on hunger. Celeste raised her eyes, and immediately wished she hadn't. Grimwald's gaze held the cold intensity of a predator selecting prey, but there was something else, something that made her skin crawl with recognition she couldn't name. Behind him, the shadows seemed to writhe with approval. "You're 19 now," he continued, circling her like a shark scenting blood. A woman groaned. "And you've caught my attention in ways that require privacy." His fingers trailed along the edge of his desk, caressing leather-bound ledgers that recorded more than mere plantation business. "My father had similar tastes, as did his father before him. It's a family tradition, you might say." The fire suddenly flared, sending sparks up the chimney like fleeing souls. In that moment of intense light, Celeste saw them clearly. Figures standing in the corners of the room, translucent forms wearing the faces of the long dead. Men, women, and children who had once served in this very house, their eyes now holding an otherworldly intelligence and fury that made her blood sing with recognition. The previous girls were disappointing, Grimwald continued, oblivious to the supernatural audience gathering around them. They broke too easily. But you... He reached out to touch her face, and she felt something ancient and terrible stir in her veins. You have fire in you. I can smell it, taste it in the very air. His hand made contact with her cheek, and the world exploded into sensation. Power that had slumbered in her bloodline for generations suddenly roared to life, flowing through her like liquid lightning. The gasoline lamps throughout the house flickered in unison, and somewhere in the walls something that had been dormant began to wake. Grimwald jerked his hand back, his eyes widening. For the first time in his privileged life, he had encountered something that didn't bend to his will. What? You feel it too, Celeste whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. The words spilled from her lips unbidden, as if spoken by someone else entirely. The hunger that's been feeding on this land, growing stronger with every scream, every drop of blood spilled in the name of your family's pleasure. The master's composure cracked like thin ice. Behind him, the mirror began to frost over despite the room's heat. And in its clouded surface, more figures appeared. Generations of Grimwald victims, their spectral forms growing more solid by the moment. Impossible, he breathed, but his voice shook with the first genuine fear he had ever experienced. You're just a slave, a piece of property. You have no power here. Celeste felt laughter bubbling up from depths she didn't know she possessed. Not her own laughter, but that of her grandmother's grandmother, Marie Thibodaux, the Creole root woman who had sworn a curse on this bloodline with her dying breath. Property? The word dripped with supernatural disdain. We were never your property, Bartholomew Grimwald. We were your judgment, waiting for the right moment to collect what you owe. The house groaned around them, timbers creaking as if the building itself was awakening from a long slumber. Through the windows, the bayou began to stir. Waters rising, ancient cypresses bending toward the house like arthritic fingers reaching for prey. The very foundations of Magnolia Bend plantation trembled as forces that had been gathering for 3 generations finally began their inexorable movement toward reckoning. Grimwald's cruel smile faltered completely as the temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. His breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the windows despite the August heat. In the mirror behind him, the ghostly figures raised their hands in unison, their mouths opening in a silent scream that somehow filled the room with the sound of breaking chains. The summoning hour had begun, and Celeste Thibodaux was no longer just a slave girl cowering before her master. She was becoming something far more dangerous, the living embodiment of every injustice the Grimwald family had ever committed. Awakened at last to claim the terrible debt they owed, the fire guttered and died, plunging them into darkness illuminated only by the otherworldly glow emanating from Celeste's eyes. In that unholy light, Master Grimwald finally understood that he had not summoned a victim to his study. He had summoned his own destruction. The bayou held its breath as Celeste stumbled through the moss-draped darkness, her bare feet finding path that seemed to open before her, like the earth itself was guiding her flight. Behind her, the plantation house blazed with unnatural light, every window glowing as if the building had swallowed the sun. She could hear Master Grimwald's roars of rage echoing across the water, punctuated by the crash of furniture being hurled against walls. Spanish moss parted like curtains as she ran, and night-blooming jasmine released its perfume in clouds that seemed almost sentient, masking her scent from the bloodhounds she knew would soon follow. The ancient cypresses whispered her name, not Celeste, but older names. Names in languages that predated the plantation's existence: Ida, Erzuli, Marie. Each syllable thrummed through her bones like recognition. Evangeline Boudreau's cabin sat on the far edge of the quarters, built where the solid ground gave way to marsh and mystery. Unlike the other slave dwellings, this one seemed to exist in a pocket of otherworldly protection. Grigri bags hung from the eaves like protective charms, and the garden that surrounded it grew plants that didn't belong in Louisiana soil, herbs and flowers that should have withered in the humid climate, but instead flourished with supernatural vitality. The old woman was waiting on her porch as if she'd known Celeste was coming, her pipe smoke curling into shapes that almost looked like faces. At 83, Evangeline carried herself with the dignity of someone who had never truly been enslaved, despite the circumstances of her birth. Her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect not just years, but centuries. "Come, child," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of old Creole mixed with something even more ancient. The spirits have been restless all evening. They knew tonight was the night the blood would remember itself. Celeste collapsed onto the rough wooden steps, her body shaking with more than fear. Power still coursed through her veins like molten silver, and with each pulse of her heart, she could feel the plantation's dark history pressing against her consciousness like floodwaters, against a failing levee. "What's happening to me, grand-mère?" The pet name slipped out unbidden. She had never called Evangeline grandmother before, but something deep in her blood insisted on the connection. Evangeline's weathered hand touched Celeste's forehead, and immediately the chaos in the girl's mind settled into patterns she could almost understand. "You Marie Thibodaux's blood, child. Her great-great-granddaughter. Though the white man's records don't show it, your bloodline has been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up and settle old debts." The name hit Celeste like a physical blow. Marie Thibodaux, whispered about in the quarters like a ghost story, a legend of a root woman so powerful that even the masters feared her name. "But Marie died before I was born, before my mama was born. Death ain't no barrier to power like hers," Evangeline said, settling into her rocking chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones held decades of secrets. "She put a curse on the Grimwald line the night they burned her at the crossroads. Said the evil they done would feed on itself until it grew strong enough to turn and devour them whole. But curses need a vessel, child. They need blood to carry them forward." Through the cabin's single window, Celeste could see the plantation house in the distance, its windows now flickering with colors that had no names, purples that hurt to look at, greens that whispered of decay, reds that spoke of old violence. The very air around the building seemed to writhe with barely contained malevolence. "The Grimwald men think they've been using that darkness," Evangeline continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. 3 generations of them feeding it with cruelty, thinking it makes them strong. But they just fattened it up, making it ready for what Marie really planned. As if summoned by their conversation, shadows began moving independently of their sources around the cabin, not threatening, more like curious relatives gathering to hear a long-awaited family story. Celeste felt no fear of them now. Instead, she experienced a strange sense of homecoming, as if she was finally surrounded by her true people. "Tell me," she whispered, and the words seemed to echo with voices that weren't entirely her own. Evangeline's eyes took on a faraway look, and when she spoke, it was with the cadence of someone recounting history she had witnessed firsthand. "Marie Thibodaux came here in 1795, sold to the first Josiah Grimwald when she was just 16. But she wasn't like other slaves. She carried the old knowledge, the ways that came from Africa and got mixed with the power of this land. She could heal the sick, speak to the dead, and make the earth itself listen to her will." The bayou around them seemed to lean in, as if the very landscape was eager to hear its own origin story. Fireflies began gathering in unusual patterns, their light pulsing in rhythm with Celeste's heartbeat. Old Josiah, he was fascinated by her power, thought he could use it, control it for his own purposes. He forced her to work root magic for him. Curses on his enemies, charms to make his crops grow stronger, bindings to keep the other slaves from running. Evangeline's voice hardened with ancient rage. But the worst thing he did was force himself on her, over and over until she bore him a son. Celeste felt something cold settle in her stomach. "My ancestor was born of rape and power, child." That mixture creates something dangerous. Marie's son carried both his father's cruelty and his mother's gifts, but the pain of his birth twisted everything inside him. He grew up hating both sides of his nature. The temperature around the cabin began dropping, and Celeste could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. In the distance, something howled, not a wolf or dog, but something that had never drawn breath in the natural world. Marie tried to love that boy, tried to teach him to use his gifts for healing instead of harm. But Josiah kept poisoning his mind, telling him he was better than the other slaves because he had white blood. Eventually that child chose his father's side. Evangeline's voice cracked with old grief. He betrayed his own mother, told Josiah about the real extent of her power, helped them capture her when she finally tried to escape. The shadows around the cabin grew thicker, taking on almost human shapes. Celeste could make out faces now, men, women, and children, all bearing family resemblances that stretched back generations. Her ancestors gathered to witness this moment of awakening. They burned her at the crossroads on a new moon in 1820, Evangeline continued, her words now accompanied by what sounded like distant weeping. But before she died, Marie called on every power she'd ever touched. The loa of her grandmother's homeland, the spirits of this bayou, the very bones buried in this soil. She wove them all into one great curse. The cabin shuddered as something immense moved beneath the earth, as if the land itself was stirring to wakefulness. Through the floorboards, Celeste could feel a pulse like a massive heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Let the evil you do feed upon itself," Evangeline quoted, her voice taking on the otherworldly resonance of prophecy. "Let it grow fat on your cruelty until it becomes strong enough to devour you. And when the time comes, let my blood remember what you stole and take back everything you owe." Understanding crashed over Celeste like a tidal wave. "The thing in the house, it's not serving the Grimwalds. I've been using them, growing stronger with every life they took, every soul they broke, waiting for someone with enough of Marie's blood to channel all that stored-up vengeance." Evangeline reached out and took Celeste's hands, and in that moment of contact, the girl saw everything. Flashes of memory that weren't her own flooded her consciousness. Marie Thibodaux standing in chains as flames licked at her feet, her eyes burning with fury that transcended death. The first Josiah Grimwald laughing as he watched her burn, not knowing he was sealing his family's doom. Generations of Grimwald men feeding their appetites while something ancient and patient grew stronger in the shadows. And threading through it all like a poisonous river, the bloodline, Marie's mixed-race descendants scattered across the South, most never knowing their true heritage, living as slaves or free people of color while carrying dormant power in their veins. All of them connected, all of them contributing to the great work that was finally coming to fruition. But why now? Celeste gasped, overwhelmed by the weight of inherited purpose.
"Why me?"
Evangeline smiled, and for a moment, her weathered features seemed to flicker, showing glimpses of a younger woman, and behind her, the ghostly outline of Marie Thibodaux herself. "Because you are the last one, child. The bloodline ends with you, which means all that power, all that stored vengeance. It has nowhere else to go except through you." The howling in the distance grew louder, joined by other sounds, the crack of breaking timber, screams that might have been human, and underneath it all, laughter that belonged to no living throat. The entity that had been feeding on the plantation's cruelty was no longer content to remain hidden. It sensed the approach of its true purpose. "What do I have to do?" Celeste asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "You gotta go back," Evangeline said simply. "Face what Marie's curse has created, and guide it to its final feast. The Grimwald line ends tonight, child. All of it. The family, the plantation, the evil they built into the very foundations of this place." As if responding to her words, every light in the plantation house suddenly went out, plunging the entire property into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Then one by one the windows began glowing again. But now the light was the color of old blood, and in its radiance, shadows moved that defied all natural law. The summoning was complete. The blood had remembered itself, and somewhere in that house of horrors, Master Bartholomew Grimwald was about to discover that there were fates far worse than death, and that his family had spent 3 generations earning every one of them. If you're enjoying this dark tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support keeps these stories coming. Dawn broke over Magnolia Bend plantation like a wound bleeding light across the sky, but the sun's rays seemed reluctant to touch the cursed ground. Master Bartholomew Grimwald stood at his study window, his reflection fragmented in the cracked glass, watching the bayou waters lap hungrily at the plantation's borders. The entity that shared his house, that had shared his family's house for generations, whispered sweet promises of violence in his ear. "She rejected you," the voice hissed, its words feeling like ice water in his veins. "Made you look weak, made you feel powerless. This cannot stand." Grimwald's hands clenched into fists as he remembered the impossible cold that had filled his study, the way Celeste's eyes had blazed with otherworldly fire. No slave had ever dared to speak to him as she had, and certainly none had ever made him feel afraid. The memory burned like acid in his throat. Blackwood. His roar echoed through the house, and within moments the overseer appeared, looking haggard and pale. The man's usual swagger was notably absent this morning. "Yes, master." Blackwood's voice cracked slightly. He had heard the sounds coming from the house all night, Furniture breaking, walls groaning, and underneath it all, laughter that made his skin crawl. Whatever had happened in that study had shaken him to his core. Find the girl. Bring her back. Grimwald's voice carried the cold fury of a man accustomed to absolute dominion. Use whatever means necessary. Sir, the others in the quarters, they're acting strange this morning. Won't meet my eyes, keep whispering in that Creole tongue. And the girl, she ain't in her cabin. Some say she went to see old Evangeline, but then get her from there. Grimwald slammed his fist against the window frame, and spiderweb cracks spread across the glass like veins. I don't care if you have to burn that witch's hovel to the ground. Celeste belongs to me, and I will have what is mine. But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. The entity that had been his family's patron for 3 generations was restless, more active than it had ever been. It fed on cruelty, on the suffering of the enslaved people who worked his land, but lately its appetite had grown insatiable. Where once it had been content with the occasional brutal punishment or mysterious disappearance, now it demanded more elaborate entertainment. She is the key, the voice whispered, and Grimwald felt phantom fingers caress his throat. Her bloodline. So much power sleeping in those veins. If we cannot possess her willingly, we must break her completely, make her suffer until she begs for the mercy of serving us. The thought sent a thrill through Grimwald's corrupted soul. Yes, that was the answer. He would make her watch as others paid the price for her defiance. She would come to him eventually, broken and pleading, and then her strange power would be his to command. Round up her friends, he ordered, his smile returning with predatory intensity. The young man who works in the stables, Thibodaux, isn't it? And that woman who shares her cabin, Delphine. Bring them to the punishment ground. If Celeste thinks she can hide behind that old crone's skirts, she'll learn otherwise. Blackwood hesitated. Sir, the others are already spooked. If we start, the others will remember their place or they'll join them. Grimwald's eyes held the cold gleam of madness. I've been too lenient, too soft. It's time to remind everyone on this plantation exactly who holds the power of life and death. What he didn't notice was how the shadows in his study seemed to writhe with anticipation, or how the temperature dropped several degrees whenever he spoke of violence. The entity that whispered to him was no longer simply feeding on the plantation's cruelty. It was orchestrating it, pushing him toward acts so vile that they would provide the final catalyst for Marie Thibodaux's curse. By midday, word had spread through the quarters like wildfire. Thibaut Boudreau and Delphine Robichaud had been dragged from their morning tasks and chained to the whipping posts that stood like monuments to suffering in the plantation's center. The other enslaved people gathered in a reluctant circle, their faces masks of careful neutrality that hid the terror beneath. But something was different today. The very air seemed charged with electricity, and more than one person noticed how the shadows fell at impossible angles, how the Spanish moss hung motionless despite the bayou breeze, how the birds had gone silent in the surrounding trees. Grimwald emerged from the house dressed in his finest clothes, as if attending a social event rather than orchestrating torture. Behind him came his son, 12-year-old Thaddeus, pale and trembling but forced to witness what his father called the education of a future master. Let this be a lesson to all of you, Grimwald announced, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. Defiance has consequences. When one among you forgets their place, others must pay the price. Thibodaux, barely 20 and strong from years of stable work, strained against his bonds with desperate strength. His eyes searched the crowd frantically. Where is Celeste? What have you done with her? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Grimwald's smile turned savage. She has abandoned you, boy. Run off to hide while you suffer for her arrogance. But don't worry, she'll return soon enough, begging me to stop. The first lash fell across Thibodaux's back with a wet crack that seemed to echo longer than it should have. As blood welled from the wound, something stirred beneath the plantation's foundations, a tremor so subtle that most dismissed it as imagination. But those sensitive to such things felt it, the earth itself recoiling from the violence being done upon it. With each subsequent blow, the supernatural phenomena intensified. The shadows began moving independently, reaching toward the punishment ground with grasping tendrils of darkness. The temperature fluctuated wildly, swinging from oppressive heat to bone-deep cold in the span of seconds. And underneath it all, just at the edge of hearing, came the sound of approaching footsteps, dozens of them, though the assembled crowd could see no one coming. Delphine began to pray in Old Creole, her voice rising above Thibodaux's agonized cries. But her prayers were not to the Christian God the masters had forced upon them. These were older invocations, calling on powers that had walked this land before European boots ever touched its shores. Urzuli, mother of the waters, hear your daughters cry. Dambala, great serpent, taste the blood spilled on sacred ground. Marie Thibodaux, grandmother spirit, remember your children. With each name she spoke, the phenomena around them grew stronger. The whip in the overseer's hand began to smoke, its leather handle growing too hot to hold. The chains binding the prisoners rattled with no earthly cause. And in the distance the bayou waters began to rise, lapping at banks that had contained them for decades. Young Thaddeus Grimwald watched with growing horror as his father's carefully controlled world began to unravel around them. The boy had been raised to see the enslaved as property, but seeing Thibodaux's suffering up close, witnessing the raw hatred in every face around him, he began to understand that his family had built their wealth on a foundation of unthinkable cruelty. "Father," he whispered, tugging at Bartholomew's sleeve, "something's wrong. Look at the shadows." But Grimwald was lost in his own sadistic rapture, feeding on the suffering before him while the entity in his mind gorged itself on the violence. He couldn't see what his son saw, that the shadows were no longer cast by the sun but were moving with deliberate purpose toward the punishment ground. He couldn't feel the way the earth trembled with each crack of the whip, or notice how the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent presence. It was then that she appeared. Celeste stepped out of the bayou mist like a figure from a nightmare, her simple slave dress now seeming to ripple with otherworldly energy. The morning light bent around her in impossible ways, and where her bare feet touched the ground, strange flowers bloomed, blood-red blossoms that had never grown in Louisiana soil. The crowd parted before her approach, some in fear, others in recognition of something greater than their earthly circumstances. She walked with the measured pace of judgment incarnate, and with each step, the supernatural manifestations around the plantation intensified. Enough. Her voice carried across the gathering with the authority of thunder, and impossibly, the overseer's hand froze mid-swing. The whip hung in the air as if held by invisible fingers, and no amount of effort could make it fall. Grimwald spun to face her, his eyes blazing with fury and something that might have been relief. She had come just as he had planned. Now he could break her properly in front of everyone. "So you've decided to show yourself," he sneered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. There was something different about her now, something that made his skin crawl with primitive fear. "Ready to beg for your friends' lives?" Celeste's gaze swept across the assembled crowd, taking in every face twisted with pain or fear. When her eyes finally settled on Grimwald, he felt the temperature around him plummet until his breath came out in visible puffs despite the summer heat. "I am not here to beg," she said, and her words carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. "I am here to collect a debt that has been owed for 27 years. The entity in Grimwald's mind suddenly went silent, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly afraid. Behind Celeste, the mist began to take shape, forming figures that watched with the patient stillness of the long dead. And in that moment he realized that his careful plans, his sadistic games had all been leading to this moment, not his triumph, but his judgment. The blood had remembered itself, and Marie Thibodaux's granddaughter had come to settle accounts. The confrontation between Celeste and Master Grimwald stretched across the punishment ground like a tableau from hell, with the assembled enslaved people caught between earthly terror and supernatural awe. The very air crackled with potential energy, as if the space between them had become a battlefield where forces beyond human comprehension prepared for war. Grimwald's initial shock gave way to rage-fueled bravado. He had built his entire identity on absolute dominion over others, and no slave, no matter how strange the circumstances, would be allowed to challenge that authority. "You dare threaten me on my own land?" he snarled, gesturing to the overseer. "Blackwood, seize her. 20 lashes for every word of insolence." But Mordecai Blackwood stood frozen, his face pale as cemetery marble. The whip had fallen from his nerveless fingers, and his eyes were fixed on the ghostly figures materializing from the mist behind Celeste. Shapes that wore familiar faces, enslaved people who had died on this plantation over the decades, their translucent forms radiating an otherworldly fury that made his blood run cold. "I can't," Blackwood whispered, his voice breaking. Master, look around you. Really look. For the first time, Grimwald allowed his gaze to sweep beyond Celeste to take in the full scope of what was manifesting around them. The bayou mist had risen to unnatural heights, forming a dome over the plantation that blocked out the sun, while somehow maintaining its own spectral illumination. Within that ethereal fog, dozens of figures moved with the slow, deliberate purpose of the long-dead finally given license to act. But it was the plantation house itself that truly made his breath catch. The building groaned and swayed as if caught in a hurricane, though no wind stirred the air around them. Windows glowed with that same blood-red light he had seen the night before, and something vast and dark pressed against the glass from within. The entity that had whispered to 3 generations of Grimwald men, now grown too large and too powerful to remain hidden. "What have you done?" he breathed. But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. The thing in his house was no longer his ally. It had been using his family, feeding on their cruelty while growing strong enough to consume them. Celeste stepped forward, and with each movement, the supernatural phenomena intensified. Flowers of impossible colors bloomed in her footsteps, their petals the deep crimson of spilled blood. The chains binding Thibodaux and Delphine shattered with sounds like breaking bells, and both prisoners slumped forward, freed but too weak to stand. "I have done nothing," she said, her voice carrying the harmonic resonance of multiple speakers. "This is your creation, Bartholomew Grimwald. 3 generations of your bloodline feeding darkness until it grew strong enough to devour you. I am merely here to guide it to its feast." Young Thaddeus Grimwald broke free from his paralysis and ran to his father's side, his 12-year-old mind struggling to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around them. "Father, what's happening? Who are all these people?" The boy's innocent question hung in the air like an accusation. Grimwald looked down at his son, his heir, the 4th generation meant to inherit this legacy of cruelty, and for a moment, paternal instinct warred with the malevolent influence that had shaped his life. But the entity in the house had grown too strong for him to resist. "Kill the boy," the voice whispered with seductive urgency. "His blood will give us strength. Innocent blood is the sweetest sacrifice." "No," Grimwald gasped, staggering backward. For the first time in his adult life, he was fighting against the thing that had guided his every cruel impulse. "Not my son. Never my son." But Celeste heard the whispers too, carried to her on currents of supernatural awareness that flowed between her and the entity. Her eyes blazed with righteous fury as she understood the depths of corruption that had infected this bloodline. "You would sacrifice your own child," she said, and the temperature around them plummeted until frost began forming on the whipping posts. "Just as your grandfather sacrificed Marie's son to his own twisted appetites? The circle completes itself, doesn't it? Evil devouring its own offspring." The plantation house suddenly erupted with activity. Every window shattered simultaneously, raining glass like deadly snow across the ground. From the broken openings poured a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow light itself, reaching across the yard with tendrils that writhed like living things. The enslaved people scattered in terror, but they found their escape routes blocked by walls of impenetrable mist. This reckoning would have witnesses. Everyone who had suffered under Grimwald rule would see justice finally served, even if that justice came wearing the face of damnation. Celeste raised her hands, and the bayou itself responded to her call. Water rose from the marshlands in defiance of gravity, forming spiraling columns that danced around the punishment ground. Within those liquid towers, more spirits appeared. Not just the enslaved dead, but the indigenous people who had walked this land before European colonization, their ancestral fury adding to the supernatural storm. "Your family thought they could build their power on stolen land, using stolen people," she continued, her voice now carrying the authority of ages. "But every drop of blood spilled in hatred has consequences. Every act of cruelty plants seeds of retribution, and now the harvest has come." The entity from the house finally revealed itself fully, pouring through the shattered windows like a liquid nightmare. It had grown far beyond the relatively minor demon the first Josiah Grimwald had summoned decades ago. Fed on generations of suffering, it had become something apocalyptic, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that towered above the plantation buildings like a storm made flesh. But as it reached toward the assembled crowd with grasping tendrils of pure malevolence, Celeste stepped into its path. The collision of her ancestral power with the entity's accumulated darkness created a shockwave that flattened every building for miles around. Except somehow, impossibly, the people in the punishment ground remained untouched, protected by the same force that had guided her here. "You cannot stop what we have become," the entity howled, its voice like breaking glass mixed with dying screams. "We are beyond your power now, little root woman. We have fed on pain for decades. We are immortal." Celeste's laughter rang across the devastated landscape, and it carried echoes of every woman who had ever defied impossible odds. "Immortal? You are nothing but hunger given form, and I know what happens to things that eat too much too quickly." She began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun, the accumulated power of every prayer whispered in the slave quarters, every act of resistance, every moment of love shared in defiance of a system designed to crush the human spirit. The entity recoiled from that radiance as if burned, but the most shocking revelation came when young Thibodaux suddenly stepped forward, placing himself between the cosmic horror and the crowd of terrified people. The boy's face was pale but determined, and when he spoke, his voice carried a strength that belied his years. "Stop," he said, and impossibly, the entity paused. "I've seen what my family has done. I've heard the stories you tried to hide from me. If someone has to pay for all this evil, it should be me. I'm Grimwald too." The noble gesture sent ripples through the supernatural conflict. Here was a child willing to sacrifice himself for people his family had brutalized, an act of pure selflessness that the entity, fed only on cruelty, could not comprehend or counter. Celeste looked at the boy with something approaching wonder. In him, she saw the possibility of redemption, the chance to break the cycle rather than simply ending it in apocalyptic violence. But the entity sensed weakness in her hesitation and struck. "If you will not give us the boy willingly, we will take him by force." The darkness surged forward, but it found its path blocked not just by Celeste's power, but by the spirits of every enslaved person who had ever protected a child on this cursed ground. They rose as one, translucent guardians whose love had transcended death itself. The final battle for the soul of Magnolia Bend plantation was about to begin, and its outcome would determine whether the cycle of violence continued into another generation, or if the accumulated sins of the Grimwald bloodline would finally find their reckoning. In the distance, thunder rumbled across a cloudless sky, and the bayou waters began to glow with phosphorescent fire. The awakening was complete. And now came the time of choosing: redemption or damnation, justice or revenge, an end to the darkness or its final triumph. If you're enjoying this dark tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support keeps these stories coming. The air above Magnolia Bend plantation crackled with supernatural energy as two cosmic forces prepared for their final confrontation. Celeste stood at the epicenter of the maelstrom, her form blazing with the accumulated power of generations, while the entity that had fed on Grimwald cruelty towered above the devastated landscape like a monument to human evil made manifest. But it was the emergence of the Grimwald ancestors that truly turned the battle into something beyond mortal comprehension. The first to appear was Josiah Grimwald the Elder, the plantation's founder, his ghostly form materializing from the smoking ruins of the great house. But unlike the protective spirits that surrounded Celeste, there was nothing noble about his spectral presence. Decades of feeding the entity had corrupted him even in death, twisting his soul into something that belonged neither to heaven nor hell. "My legacy," he moaned, his voice carrying the weight of a century's worth of accumulated guilt. "Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for, it was all for nothing." Behind him came Josiah the Younger, Bartholomew's father, his ghostly features bearing the same cruel beauty that had marked all the Grimwald men. But where the living Bartholomew still retained some vestige of humanity, his father's spirit radiated pure malevolence, a soul so steeped in cruelty that death had only concentrated its essence. "We gave you everything," the younger Josiah hissed at the towering entity. "Our souls, our humanity, the blood of innocence. And this is how you repay us? By turning on your faithful servants?" The entity's laughter shook the very foundations of reality. "Faithful servants? You were never anything but cattle, feeding me with your petty cruelties until I grew strong enough to harvest you properly. Did you truly believe that evil serves evil? I serve only hunger, only the endless need to consume." Young Thibodaux pressed closer to Celeste, his child's instincts recognizing her as protection against horrors his sheltered mind could barely grasp. But Bartholomew Grimwald, still alive and still fighting the entity's influence, reached desperately for his son, Thaddeus. "Come to me," he pleaded, and for a moment, paternal love flickered through the corruption that had claimed his soul. "Whatever happens, you're still my blood, still a Grimwald." "That's exactly the problem," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the supernatural chaos with devastating clarity. "The Grimwald blood is poison. 3 generations of feeding darkness, of choosing cruelty over compassion, of building wealth on the bones of the innocent. Your bloodline isn't a legacy, it's a curse." The truth of her words resonated through the assembled spirits like a bell-tolling judgment day. The ghostly figures of the enslaved dead pressed closer, their translucent forms gaining substance as their righteous fury gave them strength. Among them walked Marie Thibodaux herself, no longer the young woman who had burned at the crossroads, but the eternal embodiment of justice delayed but not denied. "My great-great-granddaughter," Marie's spirit whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent waiting for this moment. "You have done well, but the choice before us now will echo through eternity. Do we break the cycle, or do we become what we fought against?" The entity sensed the moment of uncertainty and struck with desperate fury. Tendrils of pure darkness lashed out toward Thaddeus, seeking to claim the boy's innocent blood for the power it would provide. But the attack was met not just by Celeste's protective light, but by something unexpected. Bartholomew Grimwald himself, throwing his own body between the entity and his son. The impact sent him flying across the punishment ground, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied, but as he struggled to his feet, something had changed in his eyes. The whispers that had guided him toward ever greater cruelties had fallen silent, and for the first time in his adult life he was thinking clearly. "I see it now," he gasped, staring at the towering horror that had been his family's patron. "We never controlled it. It was always controlling us, pushing us toward worse and worse acts to feed its hunger. My God, what have we become?" The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled spirits. Josiah the Elder let out a wail of despair that shattered every remaining window for miles around, all of it unmeaningless. Every soul we broke, every life we destroyed, it was just food for this thing. But Josiah the Younger refused to accept responsibility. "No!" he shrieked, his ghostly form becoming more solid as his rage intensified. "We were the masters. We ruled this land with divine right. These slaves, these creatures, they exist only to serve us." His words triggered a response from the entity that surprised everyone present. Instead of supporting its former servant, the cosmic horror turned on him with predatory glee. "Divine right?" It laughed, wrapping tendrils of darkness around the younger Josiah's spirit. "You pathetic fool. You ruled nothing. You were my puppets, dancing to melodies I played in your dreams, and now you will serve me in a more direct capacity." The ghostly Josiah screamed as he was pulled into the entity's writhing mass, his spiritual essence consumed like kindling thrown onto a fire. The act of cannibalism sent ripples of power through the creature, making it even more monstrous and terrible. "This is what evil does," Celeste called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the supernatural battlefield. "It consumes everything around it, then turns on itself when nothing else remains. The Grimwald legacy isn't one of power, it's one of self-destruction." Bartholomew stared in horror as his father's spirit was devoured, finally understanding the true nature of the force his family had served. "How do we stop it?" he asked, his voice broken with despair. "How do we end what we started?" Celeste looked at him with something that might have been pity. "You can't. Only I can, because I carry both the power to destroy it and the wisdom to know what must be destroyed along with it." She raised her hands, and the bayou itself responded to her call. Water rose from the marshlands in impossible spirals. But this wasn't the murky brown liquid of the swamps. This was something older, cleaner, carrying the memory of what this land had been before European greed corrupted it. The indigenous spirits that had answered her call earlier grew more solid, their ancestral connection to the earth lending strength to her working. But as she began to weave the forces that would destroy the entity, Marie Thibodaux's spirit placed a ghostly hand on her shoulder. "Child," the ancestor whispered, "to destroy something this powerful, this deeply rooted in the land itself, will require a sacrifice beyond what you might be willing to pay. The curse I laid was not just on the Grimwald blood. It was on this entire plantation, everything built on suffering. To cleanse it completely, Understanding dawned in Celeste's eyes. To truly end the cycle, she would have to destroy not just the entity but the cursed ground it had infected, the buildings that had housed generations of cruelty, and possibly herself in the process. The power required would consume everything within miles, reducing the plantation to nothing but clean bayou water. "What about the others?" she asked, glancing at the terrified enslaved people who had been forced to witness this supernatural reckoning. "What about him?" Her gaze settled on young Thibodaux, still cowering but showing remarkable courage for a child thrust into cosmic horror. "That choice is yours to make," Marie replied. "Justice or mercy, destruction or redemption. The power is in your hands now." The entity, sensing the conversation between ancestor and descendant, roared with renewed fury. "You cannot unmake what has been made. We are eternal. We are hunger incarnate. We will find new servants, new blood to feed upon." But Celeste smiled, and in that expression was the accumulated wisdom of every woman who had ever faced impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. "No," she said simply. "You won't." The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether justice could transcend vengeance, whether the cycle of violence could truly be broken, or if some sins were too deep to be forgiven, only ended. In the distance, the bayou waters began to glow with phosphorescent fire, and the very ground beneath Magnolia Bend plantation started to tremble as forces older than human civilization prepared to reclaim what had always been theirs. The legacy of screams was about to reach its crescendo, and from its resolution would come either damnation or redemption for everyone who had ever walked this cursed earth. The moment of ultimate choice arrived like dawn breaking over a battlefield, strewn with the debris of centuries. Celeste stood at the nexus of cosmic forces, her mortal form blazing with ancestral power while the entity writhed above her like a storm made of malevolence and hunger. Around them, the supernatural audience held its collective breath, the spirits of the enslaved dead, the corrupted ghosts of Grimwald ancestors, and the living witnesses to this final reckoning. Young Thibodaux Grimwald, his 12-year-old mind stretched beyond its limits by the horrors he had witnessed, made a decision that would echo through eternity. Breaking free from his paralysis, he stepped forward and placed his small hand in Celeste's glowing palm. "I don't want to be like them," he said, his voice barely audible above the supernatural tempest, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I don't want to carry their poison. If you can break the curse, if you can end this, I'll help you, even if it costs me everything." The gesture sent shockwaves through both realms of existence. Here was Grimwald, the heir to generations of cruelty, willingly choosing to sacrifice himself to undo his family's legacy. The entity recoiled as if burned, its cosmic hunger unable to comprehend such selfless determination. Marie Thibodaux's spirit materialized beside them, her ancestral wisdom flowing into Celeste like a river of liquid starlight. "The boy's choice changes everything," she whispered. "Innocent blood willingly given can break any curse, but child, the power required will transform you into something beyond mortal understanding. You will become the guardian spirit of these waters, bound to this place for eternity." Celeste looked down at Thibodaux, seeing not the spawn of her oppressors but a child brave enough to reject the evil he had inherited. Around them, the other enslaved people watched with a mixture of terror and hope. They had lived their entire lives believing that justice was impossible, that the powerful would always triumph over the righteous. Now they were witnessing the fundamental laws of their universe being rewritten. "What about them?" she asked, gesturing toward her people. "Will they be free?" "Free to choose their own paths," Marie confirmed. "The plantation's power over them dies with the entity. But you, my child, will become something greater, the eternal protector ensuring that such evil never takes root in these waters again." The entity sensed the shift in cosmic balance and launched its final desperate assault. Tendrils of pure darkness lashed out from its writhing mass, seeking to drag both Celeste and Thibodaux into its hunger before they could complete whatever work they were attempting. But it found its path blocked by an unexpected alliance. Bartholomew Grimwald threw himself into the entity's path, his corrupted soul finally finding purpose in protecting his son. Behind him came his father, Josiah the Elder, the ghostly patriarch making his own choice between damnation and redemption. Even in death, even twisted by decades of evil, some spark of humanity remained. For once, Bartholomew gasped as tendrils of darkness tore through his flesh. Let a Grimwald die for something other than cruelty? The sacrifice gave Celeste the moment she needed, drawing upon power that reached back to the foundation of creation itself. She began the great work that would unmake everything the Grimwald plantation had become. The bayou waters rose in impossible spirals, no longer the murky brown of corrupted marshland, but the clear, sacred waters that had flowed here before human greed poisoned the earth. Indigenous spirits, the original guardians of this land, emerged from the depths to lend their strength to her cause. African orishas, called across an ocean of suffering, added their voices to the chorus of liberation. Every prayer whispered in the slave quarters, every act of love performed in defiance of a system designed to crush the human spirit, every moment of resistance throughout the plantation's bloody history, all of it coalesced into a force of redemption that even cosmic evil could not withstand. The entity's roar of fury shattered reality itself as it felt its accumulated power being systematically dismantled. You cannot unmake us. We are eternal.
We are hunger incarnate.
You are nothing, Celeste replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that belonged to forces older than human civilization. But the absence of love, and love when it finally awakens fills every void. The transformation began at her feet and spread outward like ripples in a cosmic pond. The cursed earth of the plantation dissolved into clean bayou water, carrying away the stains of centuries. The great house with its monuments to cruelty simply faded like a fever dream, replaced by cypress trees that had never been cut down to make room for human ambition. As the cleansing wave expanded, it touched each of the enslaved people who had witnessed this cosmic battle. The invisible chains that had bound them, not just physical bondage, but the psychological scars of generational trauma, dissolved like mist before the dawn. They were free not just to leave, but to truly live, their spirits healed and their futures their own to write. But the most profound transformation occurred in young Thaddeus Grimwald. As the cleansing power washed over him, it burned away not just the curse that had tainted his bloodline, but the very memory of the plantation's existence. He would wake tomorrow in the home of free people of color who had found him wandering the bayou, his mind clean of his family's legacy but his heart retaining the courage and compassion he had shown in this moment of ultimate choice. The entity made one final, desperate attempt to preserve itself, launching every tendril of darkness at Celeste in a bid to drag her into destruction with it. But the attack was met by something it could not comprehend or counter. The combined will of every soul who had ever chosen love over hate, hope over despair, justice over revenge. This is impossible. It shrieked as its form began to dissolve. Evil is eternal. Cruelty is the natural order. You cannot destroy what humans will always choose to embrace. Perhaps, Celeste acknowledged as her own mortal form began its transformation into something beyond flesh and blood. But in this place at this time, love has proven stronger. And that victory, however temporary, is enough to ensure that your particular brand of evil dies here. The explosion of light that followed could be seen from New Orleans, a pillar of radiance that reached from the bayou floor to the stars themselves. When it faded, Magnolia Bend plantation was gone, not destroyed but never having existed at all. The timeline had been rewritten, the curse erased so completely that reality itself forgot the evil that had once festered in this sacred space. In its place stretched pristine wetlands where cypress trees grew in patterns that almost looked like protective symbols. The bayou waters ran clear and sweet, and sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark, travelers reported seeing a young woman walking on the water's surface, not threatening, but watchful, ensuring that the sins of the past could never take root again. Of those who had lived through the plantation's existence, only scattered memories remained. Thibodaux woke in a free settlement 50 miles north, his scars healed and his heart light with inexplicable joy. Delphine Robichaud found herself in New Orleans, her children safely beside her and papers in her hand declaring them all freeborn. Others discovered themselves in similar circumstances, their lives rewritten by forces beyond their understanding, but blessed with the freedom they had always deserved. Bartholomew Grimwald simply vanished, his corrupted soul finally finding the peace that had eluded him in life. Some said he became one of the lights that danced over the bayou on summer nights, not threatening, but serving as a warning to any who might think to rebuild what had been righteously destroyed. And in a small cabin near what had once been the plantation's borders, An elderly woman named Evangeline Boudreau smiled as she felt the cosmic balance shift toward justice. She alone retained a clear memory of what had transpired, entrusted with the story so that future generations might understand the price of evil and the power of love to overcome even the darkest legacy. The cruel legacy had indeed come to an end, not through vengeance but through the ultimate triumph of compassion over cruelty. In the depths of the bayou, Celeste Thibodaux continued her eternal vigil, ensuring that the waters she protected would forever run clean, and that no child would ever again suffer as she and her ancestors had suffered. The screams had been silenced, the chains had been broken, and in their place rose the eternal song of freedom, a melody that would echo through the bayou waters until the end of time. If you're enjoying this dark tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support keeps these stories coming.